Hello, this is ATUK's podcast, the show that combines science, economy, environment, technology, and society. ATUK's vision is to redefine the relationship between humanity and nature. I am Boris Ochoa Tokachi, your host today, and our guest is Adrian Vogl. Adrian is the co-founder of Natural Capital Insights, an international consultancy firm that works from the US, and we will talk to her about natural capital approaches and the valuation of natural capital. Thank you very much, Adrian, for being here. Adrian, tell us a bit more about you. Where are you from? What do you do? What are your passions?
Well, I originally grew up in the southern part of the U.S. in Texas, and I grew up in a city. So I feel like even as a child, I was always sort of drawn to like natural spaces. Although in the urban environment I grew up in, that meant like finding the little drainage streams or the ponds or the parks, But since then, as I went to school also in the U.S. and Arizona, and then back in Texas to do my doctorate degree in an interdisciplinary course on natural resources, water resources management. And so since then, I have worked as a researcher and a senior scientist with the Natural Capital Alliance, which was formerly the Natural Capital Project at Stanford University. And I basically tried to apply the scientific background that I have in water resources modeling and quantification, trying to apply that to practical problems of society, like how do we make sure that we have enough clean water for people to drink, for people to enjoy in rivers and lakes. And then in the past, 5 or so years, I've branched out beyond water more into other kinds of benefits of nature, which is, I think, what we're going to be talking a lot about today.
Yeah, that's great. You mentioned one key term, natural capital. What is natural capital?
Well, so by definition, natural capital is it basically encompasses all of the natural ecosystems, water, soil, those kinds of things. And it was defined and conceived as a concept, as a way to try to bring nature into the traditional kind of factors of productivity approach of economics. The other factors of productivity are built capital and human capital and financial capital. So natural capital was the idea that, actually none of these other kinds of capital or economic prosperity at all is possible if we don't have the basis of nature on which that depends. But for me personally, I think natural capital is really a way, it's really a way to help translate the sort of the joy and the potential that I feel when I'm in a natural place, especially in wild nature. I feel that joy, I feel that potential, I feel that well-being and that sense of possible. It's a way to translate that feeling to people who are coming from a completely different background and who don't think about wild mountains and forests and sparkling water the way that I think about it.
Uh-huh. Why do you think it's important that we talk in that language, to put nature in financial or capital terms?
Well, that's an interesting question, because I think that I would actually split out the quantification or understanding or evaluation of natural capital and its benefits from putting it in monetary terms. And I think of it as like, the monetary valuation is a tool. And just like any other tool, it has certain times when it's valuable and certain times when it's not. For example, if you take the example of a hammer, right? And you could ask the question of like, well, why is it good to have a hammer? Or why is it good to use a hammer? And actually, if you want to build a house, it's perfect. You want to use a hammer to build that house. It's very useful. But if you're trying to resolve, a really complicated, emotionally charged fight with a family member, for example, that is the time when you don't want to get the hammer out, So just like that, I think that, the mapping of natural capital and understanding is something that I've spent most of my career doing. And that means, understanding the places where natural systems are providing benefits to communities, to people, and then how those people benefit from that. And really fundamentally, that lets you ask the question of, if those values are at risk, if they're at risk from climate change, if they're at risk from being paved over for a strip mall, or if they're at risk from a policy that incentivizes widespread deforestation, if those places are at risk, then how does that not only impact the nature, but how does that impact flow down to impacts on people and impacts on their economic prosperity, on their well-being, on their health? And I think that that's super important. And in some cases, actually putting an economic value on that is also very helpful when you're talking to the right audiences, you're talking to the right people. Like just earlier today, we were in a meeting with the Ministry of Finance and Economy of Ecuador, and that's the language they understand. And that's the time when you want to bring out the language of value, because otherwise, in a purely economic sense, if you don't put a monetary value on nature, then the value is assumed to be zero.
Yeah. You told us about growing up, enjoying nature, all these experiences that you had as a child. What is your passion, and how do you think that passion shaped what you do today?
Well, it's a really interesting question that you ask, and I think, really deep down inside, I think that my passion is to live my life in relation to and really in direct interaction with wild nature. And for me, that means, right now I'm living in California, and I'm very lucky to be living in a place where I'm close to the ocean and I'm close to the mountains. And so that means for me right now, spending as much time as I can, rock climbing and hiking and backpacking and just being in these wild spaces. And it's funny because my career has been spent mostly in meeting rooms and in offices, government offices. But I think that, at the very base of it, my goal is to try and protect those wild places. And so doing what I can to be a translator, to give people a reason to want to protect those spaces that I love, that I get so much fulfillment out of. And so that's why I really, the concept of ecosystem services, the benefits that we get from nature, the benefits we get from natural capital, that framework really appealed to me, because to me it's a way to reach across the aisle in a way, to people that you wouldn't normally talk to. And I worked for a while as in conservation issues in Texas, in rural areas in Texas, where when you come with a purely conservation message, you spend your life just beating your head against a wall and getting nowhere. And I found this framing was a way that I felt like we're actually getting somewhere. We're actually getting through to people in some small way, and sometimes in a big way.
You told us you were a researcher at Stanford University, and Stanford is a well-known university, a very famous one. How was that jump from Texas to California to Stanford, a world-class university? How difficult it is to do that?
Well, actually, I didn't find it very difficult at all. It was a very exciting time in my life, that transition. I had just finished my PhD program at Texas State University, and I was awarded a postdoctoral position at Stanford. So it was super exciting for me to be surrounded by people who were, really intelligent, really passionate about what they do, feeling like I was in a place and with a group of people where I could potentially make an impact in the world. So that was great. And then also the skills that I brought from my previous experience on just working with stakeholder groups and understanding from a very practical perspective, this kind of thing came from the work that I did in Texas, from a very practical perspective, understanding what are the real issues that people are trying to deal with, and how can you fit kind of the conservation goals into that. That was a really exciting and interesting transition for me.
Yeah. And later you went out and founded Natural Capital Insights, a private company, a consultancy company that works internationally.
Okay.
What do you think of that jump, going from research, from science to the private sector?
Yeah, that was actually another exciting transition. And I guess one thing I should say about, the transition from working on conservation issues in rural Texas to working with the Natural Capital Project, where suddenly I was traveling all over the world and going to many different countries. It gave me this perspective of kind of the way that we think about things, the way we do things in one particular place is not the way that there's just such a variety of approaches to address the problems in the world. But then working through this academic institution for over a decade, I also felt like there's so much potential for these approaches to be mainstreamed into the way that companies do business and the way that governments do business, the way that multilateral banks finance big projects, big infrastructure projects. There's so much opportunity, and the capacity or just sort of the structural system of academia doesn't always meld very well with the way that these companies want to do business. And so what we're trying to do with Natural Capital Insights, me and my co-founders, is to create a company, create a space that we can sort of be that boundary organization or be that translational organization between the academic work, the cutting edge science, but then being able to focus less on, how much we're publishing or whether it is cutting edge science, being able to focus on bringing that science into practical application at the kind of the time scales and the level that works really well, that resonates with the systems that already exist in the world.
Yeah. And you talked about international, and I think that's very important and interesting because you've worked in projects in Asia, Africa, Latin America, North America. What are some of the most striking examples that you've seen during the work that you've done? Because you were also working at the World Bank at some point as well.
That's right. Yes, I did work a lot with the World Bank. But what striking in what sense?
Like inspiring examples, for example, that you've seen around the world of what governments are doing or people in those countries are doing to mainstream these natural capital approaches.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's a really good question. And I think one of the things that's really going to move the needle on the way that humanity interacts with nature is having these really positive examples of success. And so, I mean, one thing that comes to mind right away is the country of Bhutan, and they're kind of a poster child, right, for sustainability. And but I think it's a well-deserved reputation. And I had the opportunity to go there and spend some time with the WWF team in Bhutan, and also meet with some government officials, and just the way that the country of Bhutan has basically said, our country is mostly covered in forests, and it's not because we've restored that forest. It's because we have protected that forest. We've kept the forest intact through this long history. And as a result, they have a certain interaction, a certain relationship with that nature that is embedded in their culture. It's embedded in the way that in their economic systems and the way that they live their lives day to day. And they've also pioneered this metric of gross national happiness as an alternative or a complement to gross national product, basically to be able to say that the volume of economic productivity is not the only measure that matters. What also matters is how much people are educated, how much social connections they have, how much, these different dimensions of happiness. And I think that that's a really, really cool example. And in other cases, I've seen several years in several different projects working in Kenya, and, going into Kenya over 10 years ago and working on doing an evaluation of ecosystem services and nature-based solutions to help them establish one of the first water fund in Kenya, which is a mechanism to invest in upstream protection of watersheds so that the water flows clear and reliably down into the city of Nairobi, as well as producing our power through hydropower and economic activity. There's major bottling companies there that use the water. But the point is that, seeing, and it's not just Kenya, but Kenya is kind of a shining example of a country that is in many ways has struggled economically over many decades. But since the first time I worked there and we were introducing this concept of nature-based solutions but now they're playing a leading role in a platform that's promoting natural capital accounting across all the countries in Africa, which is in collaboration with the World Bank and the African Development Bank and other multilateral banks. And it's just really been inspiring to see how they've taken this concept from kind of a project level local idea to now a national initiative that they're promoting. And it's not that they figured it all out, but they've got the momentum, they've got the people in the right place. They've got things going, and that's really great. I mean, I could probably talk a lot about this forever, but a final example that I might mention is that of Chile. And Chile has created or institutionalized a natural capital committee, which is, I believe, unique in the world in that it is not, normally we see these natural capital approaches embedded within a Ministry of Environment or a Ministry of Planning or Directorate of Planning or something like that. But in Chile, they've actually institutionalized a multi-institutional committee that's made up of Ministry of Finance and Ministry of Environment and Ministry of agriculture, planning, all these different groups that is meeting to actually discuss across different sectors how they can use these ideas and these approaches to improve the management of natural resources throughout the country across multiple sectors.
Mm-hmm. And you mentioned the example in Bhutan about this happiness index. We had something similar in Ecuador, which was this concept of summa causae or buen vivir, in which we wanted to assess more the quality of life than, for example, GDP to measure the success of the country. And talking about Ecuador, in Ecuador, ATUK and NCI are working in a natural capital implementation project in the biosphere reserve in the Yasuní region. Can you tell us a bit more about this project?
Yeah, we're actually super excited to be partnering with ATUK on this. It's kind of a dream because I think, you and I met maybe 10 years ago or something. It's kind of a small world of people working on these concepts, and we were looking for a way to work together for many years. So I'm glad that we finally were able to find a way to collaborate. So what we're doing is, the Stanford University, along with the Inter-American Development Bank and funded by the Jeff, has a project where they are providing support for the implementation of natural capital approaches in 5 countries across Latin America. And one of the countries that was selected was Ecuador. And so now the team at Stanford, Natural Capital Alliance, ATUK, and NCI have developed an analysis of the natural capital and ecosystem services of the Yasuní Biosphere Reserve. And in that project, we've basically been able to show how the forests and other natural systems in the Biosphere Reserve support tourism, support clean water for the people that live there, also support, ultimately the rain that falls on the Andean regions upwind of the Biosphere Reserve, along with other ecosystem services, quantify how much those are providing benefits to people. And also we've done we've done economic valuation on a selection of those services, basically to make the case that the natural systems in the reserve itself are providing a real economic value to Ecuador, and therefore those natural resources there are actually strategic natural assets that the country should be managing as they manage other strategic assets in order to ensure continuing prosperity and sustainability for the country.
And we are also very excited about this alliance between NCI and ATUK. From all this experience that you've gathered throughout these projects and these international initiatives as well, how do you think that we can redefine the relationship between humanity and nature?
Yes, that's a simple question. No, I think it's actually a really great vision to have. How can we redefine the relationship between humanity and nature? And honestly, although we've spent all this time talking about quantifying natural capital and putting a value on it, I don't think that is ultimately the answer. It is a piece of it. It's a piece of the answer, but I think that changing people's hearts and minds is not going to be just through numbers. We can tell people the value of nature is so many trillions of dollars or whatever, but I think what really is going to redefine relationship between humans and nature is getting people direct personal experiences with nature. And I think that that's easier for people who, live in rural areas or who are more affluent and have access to green spaces and open spaces. But I think there's a huge role to be played for programs that bring marginalized or poor kids into natural settings, giving them direct experiences with nature, programs that allow access to national parks and other wild spaces to people who might not otherwise have the means to get there or the means to pay the entry fee. I think those kind of programs are super important because until people actually have that kind of personal, visceral experience that, wow, this nature actually is a really cool thing, like the whole list of numbers is never going to convince them.
Yeah. What is the final message that you would like to give to a ATUK podcast audience?
I guess on that note, then the final words that I would have for the ATUK audience is to go get yourself out in nature, go get lost in a forest, go swim in a wild stream, just experience it for yourself so you can really feel the value that it has. And then hopefully you can join us in the fight to protect it.
Thank you very much, Adrian. This has been a very inspiring experience.
Thank you, Boris, for having me. I've enjoyed it.
This episode of ATUK's podcast has been brought to you thanks to the Natural Capital Alliance from Stanford University. Don't miss out on the previous podcast episodes. We are in Google Podcasts, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Vogl, and also on YouTube. Thank you very much.